Xi Jinping blamed African delegations for conceding far too quickly, and he particularly blamed the South Africans with Jacob Zuma for signing on to this deal. Now that's just gotten worse and worse, including in Durban at the COP17 in 2011. But then came the COP21, which was Paris. And I'll just conclude, because with Donald Trump, finally, you're fired. It looks like the United States will quickly re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement. But I'm going to make the argument that the activists need to step up, because that's not enough. This is an inadequate, insufficiently ambitious, and non-binding deal. There are no accountability mechanisms. When Trump left, there was nothing to prevent him. There's what we call a privatization of the air, carbon taxation that is unfortunately injudiciously applied. You saw a big movement in France and another one in Ecuador as a result. And carbon trading and offset gimmicks have taken their place. The climate debt that I've already mentioned, I certainly owe to the victims of climate change. It's completely written out of the Paris Climate Agreement. We don't have a just transition to give us jobs. We also need to get rid of the intellectual property restrictions that prevent getting good technology here. We've got to bring in the military, the maritime, and air transport. Those are left out of Paris. And we need fossil fuel owners to leave the gas, leave the coal, leave the oil under the soil, and to revalue these stranded assets, this unburnable carbon, accordingly. We do have these movements. I'll wrap up now, but 1 million climate jobs is one from AIDC in Cape Town. There's a network called the Climate Justice Coalition that also includes some of the big labor movements, SAFTU, as well as 350.org and community movements. And then there's a climate justice charter that's also being developed. These are the sorts of things that give me enormous hope and faith that in a place like South Africa, there were certainly the climate villains, and we have way too many climate victims. These are some of the books I've written to pay testimony to how extraordinary the activists are, and how I hope they, and especially the youth, will pull us out of it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. As I said earlier in my introduction, I'd like to open the space for those who have joined us to ask you questions while your presentations and your contributions are fresh on everyone's mind. While people are preparing those questions, which can be entered either through the chat function at the bottom or the Q&A, I can see both. A really interesting thing that you touch on, and which has become very apparent right now, is that firstly, the most critical social justice struggle of our times is climate change, but also that there's a way in which the struggle for the struggle for climate justice is linked to other struggles for social justice. How do you think this will change the way that we see the world, and also the way that our value systems are in the world, in terms of connecting climate change to all of the other struggles linked to great big bad capitalism?
Well, it's true that, Tiny, as you say, the dilemma of linking the issues, connecting the dots, has sometimes escaped us. But let me give you a few examples where it's not, where some of the more advanced social activists have taught me how to make these dot connections. We have an ESCOM crisis, and there are activists saying we need to question the World Bank's loan for the Medupi coal-fired power plant, which was based on corruption, right? This is Hitachi buying Chancellor House, right, as a 1/4 local investor so they could get this huge contract for boilers. And it seems to me that's one of the areas where connecting the dots to corruption, since all of our capital-intensive, carbon-intensive projects can be attributed to the kind of characters in ESCOM, the Brian Melethitebs, in Transnet, Siabanka Gamas, who were absolutely explicit in doing terrible deals with Western companies and banks. Hitachi and the World Bank are very openly guilty here, but also the East and the BRICS. And I mentioned particularly the China Development Bank, which funded China South Rail to sell Gupta-connected locomotives, whose purpose is to extract and export 18 billion tons of coal from the Waterberg through Richards Bay, right? Just absolutely insane. It's the single biggest project in the country at 800 billion rand. When I see people in Soweto who are trying to reconnect their electricity because they've been cut off because the prices are too high because of this corruption, going into coal-fired power plants or coal export lines. Then I see activists in the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee who do connect the dots, and they say, hey, we want free solar electricity, not this corrupt, expensive coal-fired power plants. You know, you could go through a few others like the agriculture sector, where activists in the food sovereignty movement are some of the key climate activists in the Climate Justice Charter, with food co-ops, with organic agriculture, localized movements. You could go and look at housing activists who want to see their structures retrofitted and to be, insulated and to have solar energy and solar hot water heaters. You can find activists who are critical of overconsumption or of disposal. There's a zero waste movement in this country. Those are climate activists, or climate activists who are also transport activists who want better public transport. Activists all over the show, you'll find once they dig a little bit deeper, they can connect the dots. And the question is, can we build from these movements, the million climate jobs that labor is very interested in, the Climate Justice Charter movement, and the Climate Justice Coalition, can we bring them all together with the most advanced forces in organized labor, social movements, communities, and those of you listening and watching who are also consumers, very conscious of how the capitalist system has tracked us into Western materialism and how we know that's not good for us, good for our social, psychological sensibility, and certainly not good for the climate.
Thank you so much, Patrick. We have some questions from the audience, and I just want to give space for these. I'm assuming that they're directed at you. The first one is from an anonymous attendee joining us who wants to ask, what should activists be asking or demanding from government in 2021, next year, that is of priority in achieving a JT? I don't know what a JT is. Please
just transition, yes.
A just transition. Great. So that's the question from Anonymous. Then Patrick Dowling asks us, in your view, what are the most effective ways of taking forward such a struggle to increase the political will of our leaders? They seem to have thick skins and deaf ears, even as the evidence of the climate problem amounts. And I think those are two questions that you could maybe approach at the same time before we move on to the next presentation.
I won't. I'm going to give all those questions to the comrades who are following, because I'll be frank. If I'm a typical petit bourgeois, vain academic, my answer would be, the politicians must just listen to reason. And I have reason on my side. And that's true. I mean, we academics do, we study hard. But if you think that's the way to change power relations, you're wrong. And it's over to the activists to tell us how really to make change. Okay? We'll pass those tough questions about how to change the power relations.
Thank you for that. And I would like to, at the end, open up a space for all of you to be in conversation with each other. And we are going to save Ayakha for the end, the most firebrand and the one with the longest time frame of activism ahead of her. So I'd like to now move on to Avena. Avena, is it okay? Can I move on to you? Avena's presentation is Environment Protection Urgencies. Avena is an environmental project manager and agricultural business founder with a passion for innovation, renewable energy, and conservation farming. She also has extensive Southern African and international experience, including in Denmark and the Netherlands. And she is doing a presentation representing Groundwork right now. So welcome, Avena.
Thank you very much, everybody. Can you all see my screen? Okay, so our topic for discussion today is obviously on environmental protection. And I want to link this quite strongly to the water factories within Southern Africa, as well as the oil and gas developments and the impending climate crisis. I think Patrick has given us a very nice overview, the contextual overview within the country, and so I'm just going to jump right in. So as we know, a number of aspects are impacted on, and that is biodiversity, our carbon sinks, the strong link between greenhouse gases and our rising temperatures, the land availability, as well as a lot of the land issues, water, food, and of course the strong link of climate change on the impacts on the most poor and vulnerable in our society. So the access to land, water, livelihoods, land displacement, the ability to self-sustain and produce food are key issues facing South Africans, as well as gender vulnerability. And so the big question we all need to ask is, how do we ensure that people live well with each other and the earth? And I think that is one of the key outcomes of a just transition as well. So I just want us to go back to President Ramaphosa's words at SONA on Friday, the 14th of February this year, who said, through these immediate measures and the work underway to fundamentally restructure our electricity industry, we will achieve a secure supply of reliable, affordable, and ultimately sustainable energy. So this is obviously a classic example of talking right and walking left. We have seen quite an emergence of gas developments within the country that is not sustainable. He's also said that he would undertake this decisive shift in our energy trajectory at a time when humankind faces its greatest existential threat in the form of climate change. So obviously acknowledging climate change impacts. So what we have seen is basically gas being touted as a clean, reliable, and cheap electricity source. And this is obviously not the case because it is associated with greenhouse gas emissions that are quite high. And it's being touted as having fewer greenhouse gas emissions compared to the coal sector. Then the DMRE has had an emergency power procurement program, which is inviting an additional 2,000 megawatts of gas. And this is mainly from gas to power projects. We have seen car power ships and the Richards Bay gas to power projects, referring to gas as being clean and transitionary renewables. So again, this is false marketing and promotion of gas by corporates and energy ministries, which are inviting an array of deadly risk to the countries of the South, who will ultimately pay the price of contamination from extraction, the depletion of our precious water systems, and the loss of biodiversity, while bearing the brunt of climate change impacts due to the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. These impacts, of course, will be borne by the most vulnerable in our society. This is just a sort of flash of some of the, the headlines in the newspapers around gas, with gas as the next battleground, particularly with the energy allocations increasing for gas. So with the additional 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of emergency energy that is mainly going towards gas. The status quo, of course, just to give you a slight overview of the gas within the country, is we currently have the draft upstream petroleum bill. We have COVID-19 directives that do impact on public participation processes, and obviously in the procurement of gas that plays a big role. We also have the RMPP, which is your emergency gas procurement, power procurement. We have the National Gas Pipeline Network, and the strategic environmental assessment for that has been completed. But with the National Gas Pipeline Network, we have corridors within which authorizations are going to be fast-tracked. We have onshore fracking, and there's a re-emergence of fracking within the Karoo. There's the KZN water factories within which Rhino Oil and Gas have current prospecting applications, and then with the offshore developments, we have KZN. In KZN, we have Sasol and Eni, which are in an appeal stage. There's Total. Total already has an authorized 10 wells, and they have applied for an additional 10 wells. We have Shell that is now joining. So there's Shell and Impact Oil and Gas that are also interested in offshore gas. We've discussed the additional power and emergency power procurement plan, which applications of which we have Richards Bay, which is an old application to resurrect 400 megawatts of power, and then also the Richards Bay Newlands 450 megawatt application. The Turkish car power ships are basically floating gas ships at the ports of Richards Bay, Durban, Mpura, and Saldanha. The EIA is in progress after the aborted COVID-19 Section 30 emergency application was foiled. So it was a few months back that the DEF's Sunny Boy Bapela had given a verbal authorization to go ahead with the procurement of power, and didn't actually follow the power procurement process as it was supposed to have been with the DMRE. So that was exposed a few months ago, and now it's part of this procurement process. Then we also have oil and gas developments in Mozambique, in Pemba, and the West Coast. So we have Recon Africa and Namibia's Kavango Basin, which is within a UNESCO site. I think part of this gas push that we have, there are a couple of issues that activists obviously need to deal with, and that is the authorizations for public participation processes, or the plans, for example, are being done by PASA, and PASA is an agency, it's not an authority. It basically promotes exploration for onshore and offshore oil and gas resources, yet it is the body that approves or disapproves public participation plans. Okay, just to give you an idea, is that PASA also makes quite a bit of money out of your oil and gas applications. So, you know, it's obviously not okay to be promoting gas as well as authorizing it. If you go onto the PASA website, you will be able to see all the oil and gas applications, the current ones, prospecting right applications and mining right applications. So you will also see, and I think Patrick had a much nicer map, just highlighting, you know, some of the current developments that are underway. Okay, this is a map of the National Gas Pipeline Network. And as you can see, a lot of it are, you know, the corridors that are being proposed that are obviously over the entire country, over all of the provinces. And what this means is obviously just not just oil and gas infrastructure, but also possible displacement of communities. It does include a lot of the biodiverse areas within our country and strategic water source areas. So I think one of the key challenges here is that the corridors actually allow for the fast tracking of authorizations. So a lot of the authorizations or the EIA processes would be shortened, so the time period for participation would be shortened. Okay, this is just another map highlighting some of the oil and gas pipeline networks. Yeah, as we all know that associated with oil and gas developments is the emissions of methane gas. These are quite potent greenhouse gas emissions, and they are about 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So any form of push in gas development will obviously increase the methane gas emissions currently, and so we will experience that impact quite strongly in the 20-year period from now. I think one of the big challenges of methane gas emissions monitoring is that a lot of it is done under normal, what they call normal operating conditions. And it is the abnormal events such as your flaring and your explosions and blowouts, etc., that would cause an increase in your methane gas emissions, and those are not necessarily recorded. And so the actual methane gas emissions from abnormal conditions can be about 60% higher than normal conditions. Okay, methane gas, as we know, is more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. We have seen extreme temperature increases, particularly in the beginning of the year, around about January, February. Okay. Shale gas is twice as bad as coal due to the fugitive emissions of methane. And of course, I think Patrick has also covered the global warming commitments. Okay, so fossil fuel development is costly not only in relation to social, environmental, and climate change impacts, but on governments and public funds. Globally, governments provide almost $1 trillion annually to fossil fuel subsidies. Oil Change International is calling on global leaders to end all fossil fuel handouts by 2020. And every dollar spent subsidizing fossil fuel production pushes us further away from achieving internationally agreed temperature goals and combating global warming. Climate change, as we know, will lead to higher food and water prices, widening the equality gap. I just very quickly want to show you the strategic South Africa's water sources. As we can see here around Drakensberg and around the Eastern Cape, as well as in Mpumalanga, and if we look down further south, these are the areas in which a lot of the new prospecting for gas is taking place. Your Rhino ER 350, for example, around the Free State and KwaZulu-Natal areas. So strategic water source areas are natural water factories, and they're vital to the national economy. They supply substantial downstream urban economies in urban centers and supply a disproportionate amount of mean annual runoff to a geographical region of interest. So there are about 200 million people living in South Africa that rely on groundwater as their primary source of water. Fossil fuels extractive industries are often prioritized as water users, which will impact directly on communities depending on this water for their survival and their livelihoods. fossil fuel developments are heavy water users and impact on groundwater reserves and water availability for existing land users. Contamination from drilling waste and pollution of surface and groundwater will add to this burden. So, yeah, as we mentioned, Rhino Oil and Gas is applying for prospecting rights in the heart of the water factories in the Free State and KZN. At the National Water Caucus held in Van der Bijl Park from the 9th to the 11th of November, the community representatives from across the country expressed their concern about fossil fuel developments threatening people's access to water, contamination of water, and their livelihoods. If we take the Vaal River, for example, there's a lot of mining, acid mine drainage that lands up in the river. And that is obviously from previous gold mining. Okay, so we've also had Recon Africa's gas drilling project approved in the Okavango Delta. This is a threat to Africa's most sensitive protected area. It is situated within the Sampriot Transboundary Aquifer System, which is the only permanent and dependable water resource area spanning South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana, and it's also part of a joint UNESCO site. And so if we do join all the dots, we'll see that the Sampriot Aquifer actually supplies the northern Karoo region, and the Karoo is dependent on this for their water supply and not so much on rainfall. So any development within that water catchment area is obviously impacting on South Africa. These licenses were obviously authorized by the government, but there was not any proper EIA process. The EIA did not have any specialist studies. It didn't include things like water balances, so it basically fell short of a lot of the compliance requirements, and yet it was still pushed ahead. The authorization for prospecting was pushed ahead. So that's currently under investigation, and we'll see what the outcome of that will be. Okay, so we also have strong links with the Mozambican gas project as campaigners. This is because we have very much the same, companies that are operating within the shores of Mozambique and South Africa. And so I think part of the environmental justice movement is connecting with other organizations within Mozambique and including Friends of France and internationally to try and tackle these developments. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. Yeah, so there are a number of impacts, obviously, from offshore drilling and fracking, and that is a lot of the wastes, the cuttings and the wastes, hazardous wastes, and then seismic surveys, which impact on sea life and biodiversity. Abandoned oil wells is a problem. We have in the US and in the north, you have over 2,000 drill rigs since 2011 have stopped operations, and you have a huge amount of job loss in the area as well. So the suicide rate amongst people who have lost their jobs is quite high in the oil and gas sector as a result. And so this whole boom within the South and within Southern Africa, we feel is quite unnecessary. Given also the time period for a lot of the emergency gas procurement process, emergency gas procurement is supposed to be up and running by June 2022, which actually allows sufficient time for renewables as well as storage capacity, and that's not happening. The thing about drilling wells, whether they are for prospecting or for permanent for extraction, is that the wells are permanent, and there are methane emissions that come through from the wells. We have a lack of oil spill modeling in Southern Africa. Yeah, so pretty much we're looking at drill wells that become permanent, and these are not necessarily monitored. And if they are, we do not have any of the monitoring results. So our oceans are up for grabs. If we look at Block 11B12, that's where the Brulpadda discovery, the last well that was drilled. And currently we have Laypat 1, which is the second well out of 10 for which a prospecting right was issued in 2012. We currently have a total applying for a second prospecting right for an additional 10 wells. Okay, so this is just giving an idea of some of the activists that SETSI has organized, a lot of the young people on Fridays, for example, just building activism and getting young people involved in some of the oil and gas and climate change issues. Okay, that's an idea. That's just letting you know what electromagnetic surveys can do, and a lot of your large mammals are quite sensitive to these electromagnetic fields. They a bit like how bats navigate using sonar. They use the same, and so this disrupts a lot of their movement and their ability to feed and to survive. Okay, so the stark reality is that we have a big gas push within the Southern Hemisphere because a lot of the oil companies are going through, so you have these booms and these busts, and so South Africa is going through a current boom in the oil investment and markets. And because a lot of these rigs are not operational in the north, they cannot afford to operate. They do have eyes on the south to try and maintain and to promote and to push the oil and gas industry. It's not really based on a need for energy, but it is based on a need to keep the oil and gas industry alive. This is just, okay, I'm just going to zoom through all of this, and we can probably talk about, some of the activism things during the questions. Yeah.
I'd really like to talk about this, the activism. I'd like to come back to what mobilization efforts you have, what grassroots initiatives you are aware of. I've also got some additional questions from Patrick Dowling as well as Beata Adolf. But what I want to do, because as you finish you kind of conclude or wrap up your presentation now, and also from Patrick's presentation earlier, I can see that there's potential for a really rich conversation to take place after. So instead of calling for questions now for you, Avena, I'd just like to move to Ulrich. Ulrich, are you standing by? I want to just invite you, Ulrich, to make your presentation. Ulrich Steenkamp is a climate justice campaigner, an activist who is currently working with Earthlife Africa, but has been involved in the climate justice and climate action space for the last 15 years. And he's about to share with us his presentation of 10 minutes about energy democracy. Thanks, Ulrich.
I thank you, Tiny, and also good afternoon or evening, everybody. Yes, I'm Ulrich Steenkamp from Earthlife Africa. I'm originally from the Karoo, like you've seen that the previous speaker has spoken of that they want to try and frack. So yes, I'm one of those that are really much opposed to it. I was a community activist, going about fighting these things that they're trying to destroy and coming with the ideas of jobs. So yeah, so thank you everyone. My topic for today is energy democracy, meaning democratizing the energy space. But just to give you a short background, I am from Earthlife Africa, Johannesburg. We are an environmental justice organization established in the late 80s in 1988. The core focus of Earthlife Africa is climate change, and then in the South African situation, our biggest contributor to climate change is our energy sector. So that is why we focus on climate and energy. From Earthlife, the biggest issue is getting people access to the decisions that are being made regarding energy, because South Africa is not necessarily an energy poor country. However, in South Africa, we have massive energy poverty. And we find that in the most ironic senses, next to the energy producers, next to your power stations, you have communities that are not electrified. So there is no proper access to the energy that we as a country produce. And in some sense, one can even say that we're producing surplus, because us as South Africa, we are selling our energy to our neighbor countries. So if we truly have to deal up with all of these things, there is a different way in which I think the population of South Africa would have a different idea of how the energy system in South Africa would work. So when it comes to giving the people on the ground access to the decision-making powers and access to all of these things, it's because South Africa has probably the world's best democratic, what you call constitution, that provides lots of legal ways for the voices of the masses to be heard. However, these processes and these legal and, so I'm sorry, Patrick, but sometimes even very academic stuff is not that accessible to the people that's being affected the most. And a lot of that is to do with how the governments and the decision makers have broken down the information. A lot of people do not have access to information, and even if they do have access to a public participation process that is taking place, for example, it is taking place in the more affluent areas, whereby those that will actually be suffering, they have to travel further, and a lot of the stuff is probably very much inaccessible for those that is going to be suffering. I can make an example of in Sasolburg, right next to the Sasol refineries, we have the community of Zambela that suffers from the pollution coming from the chemical petrol plant that is there. And when it comes to the environmental impact assessments or the different kinds of public participation processes regarding the emissions, the community of Zambela has difficulty in accessing those meetings unless the meetings is taking place at their township. It is completely difficult for them, or actually completely impossible for them sometimes to get to these meetings, because it will either be held in Bloemfontein or in Johannesburg, and Sasolburg is in the middle of the two, so either way they are stuck. And then they can't address the issues that they are suffering. Like, so I'm right next to a power station, I'm living in Lipalale, but I don't have electricity. I can see the electricity pylons crossing my neighborhood. We're in an informal settlement or a newly formalized settlement, but we still do not have access to electricity. Yet this electricity is going mostly to the ones that are producing a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions. The majority of our energy is going to the mining sector and to the other chemical processing plants and all of these heavy energy intensive industries. And these ones are the ones that are contributing to South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions. This is why, even though we as South Africa, we are in a so-called global south country. We are a non-industrialized country, but we are emitting greenhouse gases to the levels that a lot of the industrialized world is doing. And even though we are generating this energy, majority of the population of this country is not reaping the benefits. And they when they want to have a say in how they can get access to these benefits, the processes are being manipulated in such a way that it is difficult for them to have their input. So this is where public participation and access to information and access to energy coincides. But the main issue is that this access to energy is creating also a massive issue, because with energy poverty, we have where people now have to go, and if they don't have electricity, they have to either go and cut down trees, which is something that photosynthesizes, that produces a lot of oxygen, but now we have to cut it down in order to burn the wood in order to cook your food at home, because you do not have access to electricity, you can't cook. Or if it's not that, for the cases for people living right next to coal-fired power stations or right next to coal mines, they use the coal that falls off the trucks that is transporting the coal. And now you have coal, which is a very, very heavy polluter. It has lots of sulfur and all of these kinds of different chemicals in there that contributes to climate change. Now you have that in their houses, in their informal settlements, in their, I don't know, them cuckoos or whatever you call the shacks. Now they're exposed not only to the pollution coming from the stations nearby, they now have this pollution source in their houses, and they need it either for warmth or for providing food for the family. And these kinds of issues that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed in a proper way, in such a way that we can enforce something that is called a just energy transition, so that we move from something that is more polluting to something that is less polluting, going to your renewable energies. And when you go to the when you go down to the grassroots level, you find that the people, they want something that is healthy for them, something that actually, when we come to our great constitution that enshrines section 24, that says everybody has the right to an environment that is clean and not harmful to their health and well-being. So now that they want this, they want renewable energy, but they also want jobs. Now, what most of the big corporate companies do when they want to come and exploit the resources that is there, they come and they promise jobs, or they promise this, or they promise that. And a lot of the times they do not deliver. And in the times that they do, they were not genuine in saying that these jobs are only temporary, or you have to be this qualified in order to do this. We can make an example of the new push for nuclear energy. They'll say, no, it will create jobs and all of this and all of that, but what is going to be creating is just jobs in the construction sector, and then one or two of the people in the community will be there for maintenance or for cleaning, and then the rest would be your nuclear physicists and all of these different types of scientists and engineers that will be working there, meaning that the community will not reap the benefits from this kind of system. So, and then when they want to have input in this, the only access, or the only information that they had access to was that which was provided to them from the corporate side, or from the mining company that wants to come and mine, or the energy company that wants to come and do this. But there's no true alternative. So when a lot of community members actually enter into the space, they come from a lack of information. They only have one side, and in order to have a balanced view, you have to see all perspectives. And this is something that is lacking when you go down to the grassroots level. So this is where organizations such as Earth South Africa and Groundwork and a lot of other different NGOs, where their work is important, whereby they go down and disseminate this kind of information and knowledge to the different communities in which they work, so that the people at least have access to the information which is rightfully theirs to begin with, because we are supposed to have prior and informed consent before anything is going to go down in your neighborhood. But in most cases, that is not told to people. The only thing that people get to know is there'll be jobs. They're not telling me that no, you'll be working there, but your people around you will be suffering. And I can make examples of all of these things. Like a lot of people might be working in a coal-fired power station, but a lot of the people around there will be suffering from air pollution, so much so that if they now want to go and apply for jobs, they might have the right skills, the right qualifications, but when it comes to health checks, they fail because the pollution that is coming from the place where they actually want to work has impacted them so that they cannot qualify when they have to go for a health screening. So will this power station or this kind of development be actually helping the kind of people or not? And it is these kinds of things that need to be spoken of. And then people push forth ideas of, no, we have to go with renewable energy. Yes, and renewable energy is a brilliant, brilliant solution, but we must be careful in the fact that we should not let it become another replacement where we have just another corporate industry running the show and there's no input from people that will be actually affected by it, whether it is good or bad. And when you go and you ask people after giving them information, or you go to ones who actually are more knowledgeable on these facts, they'll say that no, what we feel as a community or what we feel as activists coming from this area, what we would like is more socially owned renewable energy resources, meaning they either want to own it themselves and be able to operate and access it or apply it to the grid. However, sometimes, or in most cases, that there's no legal framework for such a thing to happen. Therefore, when we want to have this just energy transition to ensure that we do not to contribute more and more to climate change, we have to put into cognizance that these people also want to have access. They also want to be a role player within the energy space, and they want to gain all of the benefits that is there. But unfortunately, there's lacks and there's gaps that does not allow for this to happen. And this is where our system is a little bit askew, because it favors the rich over the poor. It favors those that live in Sandton versus those that live over Soweto. If I can make a local example of me here in Gauteng. Yeah. But that is more or less what I wanted to convey. So I'd like to hand over to Tiny. If there's any questions or comments, I would be more than happy to respond. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ulrich. And in fact, on your last point there is question/comments that came from Patrick Dowling, where he says, is the uptake of renewable energy not inherently more just that, continuing with fossil fuel-based energy? And I think there's a way in which you kind of touch on that, and I'd love to elaborate on this some more. But I want to bring in Ayakha, allow her to introduce herself to the audience, and then I'd love to invite Patrick, Ulrich, and Avena into a kind of conversation where we also engage with the questions, the amazing questions we have from the audience. Now, Ayakha Melithafa is an environmental activist and a student at the Center for Science and Technology in Khayelitsha. She's one of 16 young people, including Greta Thunberg, Alexandra Villaseñor, Carl Smith, Katarina Lorenzo, who filed a complaint to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child for failing to adequately address the climate crisis. Melithafa is also, Ayakha has also contributed to the Project 90 by 2030. You Lead Initiative, a South African organization committed to a 90% reduction in carbon by 2030. She was recruited by Ruby Sampson last year to join the African Climate Alliance Youth Spokes team, where she was given opportunities to do presentations and attend conferences and other climate action events. And she also serves as a recruitment official for the African Climate Alliance. Ayakha, welcome.
Thank you for that very interesting introduction. Wasting no time, let's get into my presentation. Okay, let me share this quickly. Okay, so I'll be talking about youth activism, especially in the climate justice realm. Let me start more about introducing myself, even though you already have introduced me. I became an activist after my family and community got severely affected by a drought that hit the Western Cape. And I was so confused about what was causing this drought because it was so unnatural. That's when I got bombarded by all of this information about climate change, confirming that global warming is real, and just telling us that our world is ending, yet we see that a limited amount of people are doing something about it. After that experience, I decided to join Project 90 by 2030, which is a social and environmental justice organization inspiring and mobilizing society towards a low carbon generation. That's where I definitely learned most of my vocal capabilities. They taught us about social engagements, how to use social media effectively. They also taught us about solar energy, alternatives to fuel and renewable resources like that, so that we can be more comfortable in talking to people about climate change, but not only listing the problems, but also providing solutions for them that they can implement themselves. We also learned how to garden here in Project 90 by 2030. We built our own solar-powered power banks, but it was also a beautiful emotional space because we went on hikes to learn more about ourselves in depth, because being in the spotlight can really take a toll on a young person's mind. So that was very important for them to actually show us how to connect more with nature and just find our safe and happy place. Through being part of Project 90 by 2030, I joined the African Climate Alliance, which is a youth-led affinity group that protests against climate inactivity here in South Africa. This was a great platform for me to actually use my voice effectively and talk for the voiceless and actually talk for nature, because nature has no voice. And I feel like it was my duty to be the voice of nature and people that were not realizing that climate change is such a big threat to our livelihoods. Here is me alongside Ruby Sampson, where we were reading the moratorium that we actually put in place. We were hoping so much that government officials would give us a right back. And after putting in the moratorium 3 times and asking for follow-backs and follow-ups, we finally got a response, which was the contact of Gwede Mantashe as well as Barbara Creasy. But that also kind of went in vain. But we're definitely not stopping. These are some pictures from the strikes that we organized last year. Last year was quite a big year for climate action and climate change. And as the African Climate Alliance, we have a youth group, I say. We have a youth group and a supporters group. Since we are youth-led, we try to make sure that we are at the forefront of all the decisions that we take. But the fact that some of us or most of us were under 18, we did need provisions from older supporters like our parents and so on and so forth. And organizing these kind of big protests is grueling, but when you have a drive and you have a passion as the youth, we can definitely make it work. Even as you see in this picture of the strike that we had last year, there's a lot of diverse voices. We try to make sure in every sense that we break the stereotype of people thinking that climate change is a Eurocentric-led movement or is a white-led movement, by incorporating people of color from different backgrounds. Even in the elected council, we try to make sure that we incorporate people from different backgrounds so that we can grasp from their knowledge and from their experiences to make sure that we have a more united front, and that played out well last year. Definitely for legalities, we definitely needed our support group because we had to sign permits, we had to have consent forms, and we really couldn't do that on our own because we were always told you're too young and you need legal consent forms. So organizing these protests was a big job, but we tried to make sure that everything was legal. We tried to make sure that everyone is safe, hiring police, trying to get people, paramedics, asking people to come and volunteer their services to help out, and making sure that people that were there to help out know actually first aid. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how the drought personally affected me. My mom is a small town farmer in the Eastern Cape, and since Western Cape and Eastern Cape are so close together, we definitely felt the effects in the Eastern Cape. Here, crops were dying immensely because there was no rain, and when there's no rain, we can't really have water from the dam to put on the crops. The crops are drying out, as well as cattle. cattle was definitely a big deal for me, because if you know, in the farming industry, cattle is like an asset. And when one cattle dies, one full-grown cattle dies, that means you're losing about 16,000 Rand in revenue. So that was a very hard hit for my mom. But just watching her being resilient and trying to make sure that we have food on the table, and that we are safe and kept taken care of, was quite motivating for me. And I'd say it was definitely my fuel for my passion. And me refusing to be passive and just letting this happen around me was definitely fuel for me to actually strive and grasp inspiration from people like Mama Charlotte Manya Matleke, Michelle Obama, and just refusing to take no as an answer. As Madam Vice President said in the United States, I eat no for breakfast. So there's definitely something that I learned from these amazing, powerful women. Now let's get into youth power. First of all, here in South Africa, we've seen the power that youth has. You saw in the 1976 Soweto uprising, when the youth in South Africa were protesting against Bantu education, the apartheid system, and we saw how big of an impact it still has on our future right now, because we have the freedom to learn in a different language. It just shows us the importance of youth involvement, and it shows us the power that the youth inhabits to actually create tangible change. And it shows us the youth will forever be in the forefront of creating change. You can't really remove the youth in every situation. We just have to guide them, protect them, and make sure that their voices are being heard. So a bit of concerns that I have when we're talking about the climate movement, or yes, the climate justice movement, especially here in South Africa, is the fact that after all that's been done, all the conferences that we have attended, South Africa is still moving forward with coal and oil. And it was in the IRP that we are definitely going to be moving forward with coal and oil. And that's so detrimental to us, because even if there wasn't climate change, South Africa would definitely be losing money if we chose to move forward with coal and oil as sources of power. So it's very annoying and frustrating as the youth to see this happening around us, where we're trying so hard to fight against it and make sure that our futures are being secure. There's also another problem that we have is youth, particularly youth of color living in the most impoverished places here in Africa, being passive. I don't believe that youth are being passive. I just feel like we have a lot put on our plate. So when we have a lot put on our plate, we have to prioritize. By prioritizing, people tend to look more on poverty, where the next meal is going to come from. People tend to look on, am I safe? Is my family safe? And they put climate change or climate justice in the back of their minds. And that's a big problem, because we see that the majority of our population here in Africa is definitely youth. We are a young country, but yet we see so high unemployment rates, and it's quite frustrating. What I like to do is to make youth actually become more involved in climate change and climate justice. I try to make them understand that climate change is interlinked to other socioeconomic injustices like poverty, like gender-based violence, like xenophobia, so that we can fight all of these socioeconomic justices as one, because I feel like if we target all of them at one, or actually stand in solidarity to each cause, we can really create impactful change in our society. These are a couple of things that I feel are the necessary steps to be taken for us to actually move forward as the youth. We see how the digital platform has played. I'm sorry about that. Let me quickly share my screen again. We see how powerful the digital platform has been since we've been stricken by COVID-19. And I definitely feel that we can still use that to put pressure on the president, put pressure on government, just to put pressure on corporations for them to know that we know what you're doing, and we will not stop until you take the necessary steps, until you follow the Paris Agreement, until you actually take our lives seriously. And another way of pressuring the government is being part of legal court cases. For example, there's a legal court case that's being held right now by the Center for Environmental Rights called the Deadly Air case. And you can support that just by being an ally, a friend to the court, or actually you and your organization, if you have organizations, by being a complainant in the code, to just build the code and make it more stronger so that we can actually oppose the fact that South Africa is moving forward with coal and oil. Something else that we can do as a collective, I'm trying to speak collectively here so that we can have faster change, because I understand that everyone has a role to play and every little thing that you do counts, but we don't have the time, unfortunately. So we have to move as a collective to make sure that we get the tangible change in time. Another thing we can do is we need more adult support. We need adults to show up to protest. We need adults to encourage each other. We need adults to encourage their children to be more active in this field, especially teachers. If teachers can educate themselves on climate change and tell their students about climate change, it will be way easier for us to actually make tangible change. But then we find that some teachers don't even entertain the constitution of climate change, and that's so grueling because they have their own kids at home. The last point I'd like to focus on is actually voting for parties that promise strong action on climate change or have a specific green focus, because I feel like that's the way we can target politicians to change their mindset on climate change. Because we see here a lot of people, a lot of countries signed on to the Paris Agreement, but we see that they aren't really holding up to it. And that's very bad for us. It's harmful for us. And I definitely feel like if people that have the power to vote, if we focus on green parties, people that actually are promising something green for our future, that will be a way for us for infiltrating the politicians and convincing them to change and switch to a more renewable and green economy and green world. I also think that a way that we can really impact change and move towards a green economy or green and more sustainable world is if we target the system of capitalism. But we know that capitalism disguises itself. We know that it's been running over and over, and the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that's quite grueling. And I feel like we know that the working class has the power to change that. Because if a worker says no, the employer has to do something because they don't want to lose their workers. But the problem is that our unemployment rate is so high, and we know that workers are disposable. So that's taking quite time for us to actually move to a greener, sustainable future, is because we can't take down the system of capitalism. But when we realize that the power is in our hands and that we have the power as civil society, as just people on the ground, the working class, if we can actually stand together and sacrifice what we can, we will be able to change our society and live for a better future. We see youth are standing up all over the world, in Nigeria, and SARS in Liberia, so on in so many African countries. We are saying no as the youth, and that is so important for us to move forward in the correct and direct way. So I'd just like to conclude that youth, we are powerful beyond measure, and we must not be complicit in the way that things are going right now. I love the fact that we are standing up in all realms. I love that the LGBTQI plus community is also standing up, and we're demanding our rights, and we're telling people that we're breaking from the status quo. So that's really powerful. I'm just hoping that this is the peak of the bad, and things can only get better from here if we all just stand up and understand our power and realize the strength that we hold. But we will always need the support of our elders. We will always need the support of the elder generation in order for us to move forward with tangible change. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ayakha. And I'd also like to thank again Patrick Bond for his earlier presentation, which was entitled From Climate Inaction to Climate Justice. And then Ulrich Steenkamp spoke about energy democracy just before Ayakha spoke, and that very detailed, informative presentation on environment protection urgencies from Avena Jacklin. What I would like to do now is to open up the floor for the questions that have been coming in via the Q&A function. I want to thank Patrick Dowling for following each of the presentations and coming up with very specific questions to those presentations. But I think some of those questions have been answered in the conversation already. So if you just permit me, I'll do a little bit of curating on my side. Let's just start with the question from Patrick Dowling about in your view, it says, in your view, what are the most effective ways of taking forward such a struggle to increase the political will of our leaders? He had these marks next to it. They seem to have thick skins and deaf ears, even as the evidence of the climate problem mounts. And an additional follow-up question within the same realm from anonymous attendee was, what should activists be asking or demanding from government, I'm assuming this is South African government, in 2021 that is of priority in achieving a just transition? And then, great, so let's just stick to that. Is there anyone that wants to kind of like give some specific kind of response to this? If you can also share some like resources in your response where people can contact in order to take action, we'd really appreciate that. Please, Ulrich, I saw your hand up.
Hi, everyone. I would like to respond to the question regarding is renewable energy not just perpetuating basically the fossil fuel-based economy? I would first of all say no. Secondly, I would ask, in what sense do you mean it? Do you mean in terms of the mining of the resource materials needed within the renewable energy sector, like your copper and your phosphate for your solar PV, or are you talking about, how are you talking about in terms of renewable energy perpetuating the fossil fuel-based industry? Because for the mere fact that the focus is contribution to climate change, well, to greenhouse gas emissions, let me just correct myself there. When you look at the emissions from coming off the entire fuel chain of a solar PV cell versus the emissions coming from energy from a coal-fired power station, they are very much, there's a huge significant difference with regards to the contribution of greenhouse gas emissions. So it won't be that. That's just an example of solar power. I can make an example of wind. I can make an example even of something like geothermal energy, or lots of different energy, renewable energy sources that could be used from the ocean, like your wave-based renewable energy technology, stuff that's less invasive than the current fossil fuel-based system that we are currently under. We are basically breaking up nature and not restoring it, whereby majority of if not all of the renewable energy technologies is working alongside or with nature in order not to harm or in order not to perpetuate the disaster that's looming above us called climate change. And just to add as a little bonus tip, when they say globally the average temperatures will rise by 1 degree, in most sub-Saharan African countries, that is, you can multiply that by 2. So if they say it's going to be warming by 1 degree or 1.5 degrees, you'll see it will probably be rising around 2 or 3. A great example would be the Northern Cape or countries like Botswana and Namibia. They would really suffer by just 1 average degree rise. So you cannot tell me that this is a perpetuation of something that is leading to climate change. For me, it's a clear and definite no. So yeah, that's just my first response.
Ulrich, would you like Patrick to kind of come in, if we kind of allow him to speak, just so he can clarify his questions, and then we can move on? Is that cool for you?
Sure, definitely. That would be good. Yes.
Patrick, they're going to give you talking permission. So if you just want to maybe come in there, clarify, so you and Ulrich can be in conversation, and it can also open our own perspective. Patrick?
Okay, thanks. Hi, can you hear me?
We can
Hello?
hear you. We'd love to see you, but no pressure.
You wouldn't, I promise. No, my question was really, I think, more about the idea of renewable energy being inherently more just than a fossil fuel-based economy, and that should one inhibit its development because it might seem to be on not a specifically just transition trajectory. You know what I mean? So is that something that one could tweak on the way, so that as renewable energy was being installed, taken up by various interest groups, some of them possibly capitalistic in nature, should one allow that to happen or resist it because it wasn't specifically done on a just transition ticket? Because in my view, allowing some of the coal stuff to continue is itself unjust, and one doesn't want that just to be tweaked by promises of jobs and so on.
Yeah.
It's just it's a problem I'm wrestling with in my mind here, and I would like to get a younger viewpoint on that. Thank you.
Okay, so yes, in a sense, a lot of the renewable energy technology is in it of itself more inherently just. The issue then, the problem comes with getting how will people then get their stuff on the grid? Will it just be your IPPs, your independent power producers, that will be allowed to get their, meaning it will only, English work with me tonight, will mostly be working with corporates and not with the communities or with your smaller role players. So in terms of that being just, it is way more just. But the thing with the just transition, when it comes to with the working sector, the civil sector, at those that are working in the coal sector, for example, there are renewable energy technologies that would allow for a just transition, whereby the skills that they have within for example, in the coal-fired power stations, they are easily transferable to something like a concentrated solar power station, whereby the ones that works in the boilers in the coal-fired power station, they can just move over and work in the boilers in the concentrated solar power station. So there is that, but our country used to lead in concentrated solar power, but we opted not to include it in the extension of our IRP. So for one reason, they said it was for financial reasons. However, there's been talk of nuclear deals with Russia that could amount to 1 trillion or more, which is way more expensive than what concentrated solar power stations would have costed. But we're opting for that. We're opting for new coal power stations and all of these kinds of different things. We're opting for new gas solutions and stuff like that. However, we are ignoring the fact that South Africa has abundant renewable energy resources. I mean, people come to South Africa to experience the African sun. We've got lots. The issue is on who will benefit. So you shouldn't go and tweak it along the way. What you should do is from the onset, you should allow small role players more access than greater role players, because the aim of a just transition is a just transition. There has to be justice involved. You can't basically now move from a fossil fuel based system to a renewable system, but the powers that be remain the same. You still have your big corporate hoo-has that was controlling the coal and the nuclear sector, for example, and the gas sector. Now they're controlling your solar sector and your wind sector. So that is something that you can't go and tweak later on. It is something that has to be done now, and it has to include the ones that will either benefit or be affected by it. So this is where my point of an energy democracy that has to work properly, and everybody needs to be informed and have access to that. So it has to be from the start. You can't go and tweak it at the end, because then majority of the damage has already been done. So rather, when you're doing it, do it now, so that you know it's just from the get-go, instead of getting to your justice at the end of the road. Yeah. So yeah, I hope that's answered your question more thoroughly. Thank you. Over to you, Tiny.
Thank you, Ulrich. You have to excuse me. It's time for azan in my neighborhood. So if you can hear the azan in the background, I hope you take it as an opportunity for you to contemplate deeper as well. But the show must go on. So I'm also aware that we all made kind of specific time commitments. I want to thank firstly everyone for making the time to attend this, but just to warn you that I'm asking the last question now. A really interesting one from the audience was about, it's from the ACA team, and it's maybe taking it out of the very, very specific climate change, deep research and science and economics as well. It says, so far a great presentation, Ayakha. My question is, when met with situations where people on the ground are mainly blamed for the state of climate, like eating meat, population size, buying new clothes, etc. How do you respond, and what do you personally feel? So this is basically a kind of rhetoric which puts the responsibility for climate action on the consumers and not on the system and the producers responsible for the system. What is your take on that? And just as another thing that came from Patrick was, in view of the youth, how would they like older people to support the climate struggle that they, the youth, are likely to experience most acutely? And that's basically it. If you could kind of address that, Ayakha.
I mean, that's actually a great question, because we do find that in this space of climate activism, normally the consumer gets blamed for creating all of this madness. But we know that corporations contribute the most to climate change, and we can't really blame the consumer, especially a consumer that is poor or a consumer of color, because if you're living in the shacks in Cape Town, you know that you can't buy new clothes every single time. Kids are lucky to have one pair of shoes at the end of each year. We know that we're supposed to save electricity. We don't have the luxury of just having lights on the whole day. Even when we're buying items from the store, the bowls that we have, the saved, like margarine bowls, we don't throw that away. We actually use it. You put sugar in that bowl, you put coffee in that bowl until it actually loses color. So we definitely know, understand the very beings of actually living sustainably and renewable. Especially in the context of talking about the marginalized people and the people that are living the poorest here in our country, and in reality those are people of color. We know that we aren't the ones that are contributing the most to climate change. That's definitely a given. We aren't the ones that are contributing, because we have been growing up in these conditions, and these conditions aren't allowing us to exploit the energy sector. They aren't allowing us to exploit our environment. We have been taught from a very young age to respect the environment and live a very low costing life. So I feel like this question could be actually people of corporations or people that are actually contributing the most to climate change, blaming the consumer isn't the way to go, because why would you produce an item, sell it to people, make it marketable, and make them understand that they need it just to blame them for consuming it? So I definitely feel like it's unfair for the people in power to blame the consumers for this kind of big problem. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's just my take on that question. And the second question, what was the second question? Sorry. Oh, you muted, Tiny.
So sorry. What do young people want older people to do to act in support of the climate struggle, which will most acutely affect young people?
There's actually a lot that the older generation can do, because right now we see that the power is in their hands, in the fact that they have the power to actually make legal change in terms that they can vote. They're the ones that are providing for families, so they have more of a say in these global matters. And what they can do is actually stand in solidarity with us. When you see your child going to a climate change strike, join them, convince your co-workers to tell their kids, and just stand in solidarity with us, and also just provide financial support. Because what we saw as the ACA, when we're organizing for people from all over the the province to join the strike is that we needed transport for people that are living in the townships to actually travel to Cape Town and protest with us. So providing that financial support, even when you're in the car, just giving a lift to fellow people that are actually going to the march as well would definitely be appreciated. But definitely we need support from the adult group in terms of resources. We need mentorship from older people. We need them to tell us that what we are doing is correct and support us in every way that they can. They also hold the power, especially the working class. So if they stop seeing it as a threat to the younger generation and start seeing it as a threat to everyone, I feel like we can really break grounds and make tangible change.
Super. Thank you so much to Patrick Bond, Ulrich Steenkamp, Ayakha, Melithafa, and Avena Jacklin for joining us on this conversation about climate change. I want to thank all of the people who came to attend this talk. Patrick Dowland, the ACA team, Happy Sad Boy, and Beata Adolf, all of you for contributing your questions. It's unfortunate that we couldn't go through all of these questions, but I hope that you also take the opportunity to follow our guests in the work that they do and engage with the activism and support the work that they're doing in grassroots mobilization. I also probably don't need to say to all of you here, but the European Film Festival is screening feature-length documentary I Am Greta, which is the only film out of the 12 films of the festival which is paid. The fee or the ticket price of 50 Rand for that film, the proceeds from those sales are going to go to climate justice initiatives. So if you can promote and share that, please share. The European Film Festival is a partnership project of the European Union delegation to South Africa and 12 European embassies and cultural agencies. The festival ends on the 22nd of November. Please visit the website www.eurofilmfest.co.za for details about other films and special activities taking place at the festival. But also please follow the festival on their social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And thank you very much for your time.